I think the one thing that, even though I was in my mid-40s when I came out as being sexually attracted to women, not men, and in my late 50s before I actually started transitioning, I don't think there's an ever too late. And the other thing is that I don't regret any of that process that got me to where I'm at. I don't think back, if I'd have recognized in my early 20s when women were flirting with me that, I was attracted to them, I would have had a totally different life. And I don't look back and regret any of that or want to change any of the way that happened. So I guess that would be the owning of your own story, whatever that might be.
Welcome to Graying Rainbows, the podcast community for people coming out LGBT plus later in life. I'm your host, Dr. Ginger Campbell. I came out as a lesbian shortly after my 60th birthday in 2015. My husband had died a few months before, and I realized that I didn't want to spend the rest of my life alone. One of the things that those of us coming out later in life have in common is the challenge of finding community. And since I've been hosting 2 other podcasts since 2006, starting a podcast seemed like a logical next step. My guest today is JAX Wheatley from Portland, Oregon. I've wanted to talk to JAX ever since I heard them interviewed on The Out Entrepreneur over a year ago. So I am really pleased to share their story with you today. Before we jump into the interview, I want to remind you that you can find more episodes of Graying Rainbows at our website, grayingrainbows.com. And you can subscribe to the show for free in your favorite podcasting app. You can send me email at grayingrainbows@gmail.com or send voice feedback by going to speakpipe.com/Doc Artemis. You can also post to the Graying Rainbows Facebook fan page, and on Twitter, we are Graying R. I'll tell you about our private Facebook group after the interview. JAX Wheatley, it's great to have you on Graying Rainbows.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
We have a mutual friend, Rhodes Perry, and he's been such a strong supporter of the show. And so I just want to give a shout out to him. Would you mind just telling us your story? And you can start wherever you want.
I knew at a very young age that I was different than everybody else. And some of that included realizing that my brother and my father had parts to their anatomy that I did not have, and that I was not like all the rest of the girls. I was a little bit different. And I kind of buried that, being someone who was raised in the 60s and early 70s. We didn't really talk about gays and lesbians unless you lived in a very gay area of the country, which I really didn't. So there were no words for what I felt. I grew up, moved to the Pacific Northwest from Southern California, got married, had kids, was doing the whole upper middle class family environment. And actually, surprisingly enough, September 11th happened. And when September 11th happened, I had a realization. I'd already been in therapy for a couple of months trying to figure out if I was going to stay in my marriage. And what I realized from September 11th is that I was never, ever going to be able to love my kid's father the way that he loved me. I told him we were getting a divorce. And I subsequently came out as, I'm sexually attracted to women. Never did identify as a lesbian because I'm actually trans. And it's been in the last 2 years. So that was in 2003. I came out with that I'm sexually attracted to women. The term I used was gay because I didn't really have another term for it because I didn't identify as a lesbian. I then jumped in the middle of the gay community in Portland, Oregon, in the professional area, was very involved with Portland Area Business Association. I've been a self-employed CPA for many, many years. That transition from being in a middle-class, straight, heteronormative relationship and lifestyle, it did convert my business into a different type of CPA practice. I went from less traditional CPA type services to serving other parts of the public, a lot of nonprofit organizations. About 2.5 years ago, I danced around the issue of being trans my whole life. And I currently have a partner who is 100% supportive of whatever that looks like in my life. And I started actually actively transitioning about 18 months ago and started taking testosterone. And then just this month, September 3rd, I actually had my top surgery. Whether I'm going to go any further than that, I don't know. It's, I take it a step at a time.
So when did you become aware that there was the possibility that you were trans? I mean, you said you danced around it. I mean, we're about the same age, I think, and transgender didn't exist, even if we did know that there were homosexuals, right? At least we weren't aware of it growing up. So when did that hit your radar?
It was after I started getting involved in the gay community here in Portland, and it started becoming more of the first transgender person I ever met and became friends with is someone who was it was a contractor who was very involved in the Portland Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce. And Simone and I became good friends. And as I was doing my own internal work, I guess it probably about 10 years ago was when I came to the realization that yes, I was born into a female body, but I wasn't a female person. I didn't know exactly what that meant. At the time, my mother had just passed away, and one of the things that happened, which was very interesting, is that I was referred to in my mother's obituary as her son, which was like, oh my God, my mother got it, even though we never talked about it. And that was probably the big light bulb moment for me, was when that happened. What was also happening at that time is that my youngest child was just getting ready to start high school, and I felt like he had been through enough that I was not willing to go through physically transitioning 10 years ago. So I pretty much, my partner and I talked about it at great lengths. She said, fortunately my partner is bisexual, which makes whatever my sex organs are or whatever that is, it's not as big of an issue to her as it could be maybe to other women. So that part of it was a lot easier for me, I think, than maybe some. I know that there are some very butch lesbians, for lack of very butch individuals who they're with someone who, when you say, I'm actually trans and I'm going to start physically changing my body, that's the end of the relationship because they want the female body. I didn't have that problem, but it was more a matter of circumstance. Life was moving. I don't know. I mean, this was 10 years ago. I was in my early 50s and everything seemed to be happening, My mother died, her father died. There were just all these things happening around us. And the actual thought of transition, actually taking steps towards a transition, didn't come up until, like I said, about 2.5 years ago when life started to calm down a little bit for me.
I have to admit that what I'm really curious about, because I just came out about 3 years, I guess, as a lesbian. I use that word because it seems to be the one we're stuck with, since the guys seem to have taken gay, which annoys me. But in Arlene Stein's book, Unbound, where she follows some young people getting top surgery, she has a chapter called The Last Butch Standing. And she kind of talks about how lesbians of a certain age, and she's probably maybe 5 to 10 years older than us, this choice didn't exist. So how would a person, and I know you don't know the answer to this, I just want to know your thoughts. How did you feel when you saw the word son in the obituary? That felt right to you?
Oh, absolutely. It was my mother's way of saying to me, my mother was always 100% supportive of me no matter what. And it was just the final statement from her that said to me, I see you for who you are and you're okay. And what's so bizarre is that for me, what about that experience also is a little bit of the history is that my mother was very politically and socially and business active in her community where I was raised, and my brother and sister were raised as well. And so she was a very well-known community figure, and everyone knew that she had 2 daughters and 1 son Yet when her obituary came out, it said she had one daughter and two sons and referred to me as her second son. So the acknowledgement that somehow that got overlooked in her obituary was kind of my indication. I do believe there are not coincidences. Things happen for a reason. And I very definitely feel like that was a communication directly from my mother saying, yep, you're okay. And I said that at her funeral at her luncheon after her funeral. It was that for me, for the first time in my life, I felt like, oh my God, my mother really did. And I could have come out to her. It would have been okay. And it has been okay. My brother and my sister have been incredibly supportive, much more so than I would have ever thought. Because one of the things I was able to say to them is that these are people who've known me for 61 years, because that's how old I am, and I'm the youngest, and they've always known I wasn't a girl. If they really look back and think about our childhood and being raised and what it was like when we were younger, I wasn't a typical girl, and I never was going to be. And they both have been incredibly supportive of the whole process, which surprised me to no end.
Have you had the occasion to talk with other women or men of your age trying to figure this out? The reason that I bring this up is because, like, for me, in this whole what is butch question, that entering the community at such a late life is confusing to me. Every time somebody says sir to me, which happens to me all the time, just because I'm not short and I have short hair. I mean, I really don't look like a guy, but that bothers me. To me, that's the opposite piece of information. That tells me, yeah, I'm a woman. I'm just maybe a butchy woman. Does that make any sense?
Yes, it does make sense. And I did have a similar experience for most of my life with that particular. Mine wasn't so much being called sir. I didn't really mind that as much because I present very masculine and always have. So that part of it didn't really bother me. What bothered me more was people telling me I was going into the wrong restroom when I would go into the women's room. And that one bothered me more than anything. And what I've discovered is that since starting to transition, when you go into a men's room, they don't care. Number one. And then even after the top surgery, it's like, oh, wow, I don't even have to think about it. The other thing that I've noticed as I've been going through my own transition process is that being in a woman's body and I cross-dressed my whole life, for lack of a better word, and dressed masculine my whole entire life from the time of when I was a kid wearing T-shirts and blue jeans, and still actually wearing T-shirts and blue jeans. But for trans women, the opposite direction, there is so much social stigma about a male body being dressed in female clothing that it is so much more difficult for them to even just pass, which is, I think, one of the reasons why there's a lot of butch lesbians, especially older ones, who maybe they would have transitioned had it been in their consciousness earlier. I actually do have one friend here in the Portland area that she's almost 10 years older than I am. And she even said, if it had been an option for me earlier in my life, I probably would have, but she's getting ready to push 70. And she's like, at 70, I'm not going to do it. For me, it was at 61, am I going to do it or not? And finally it was, yes, I'm going to do it.
So what's the biggest surprise of this whole process that you would share?
The most interesting part for me was the few clients I did lose after coming out as trans very much surprised me. They were mostly lesbians, very committed lesbians, and it shocked me because it was, and a couple of them were people that I thought I had really good relationships with, and it's like, wow. And they didn't even tell me why, so I don't know if it has anything to do with being trans. And the other thing is that I found that I was fortunate that there are a group of gay men who are not, that I associate with. We have this thing called Queer Yoga Church that we do every week, and they're not the typical toxic masculinity that you find sometimes with a group of gay men. And they have been amazing in accepting me as a man and helping me and teaching me things, going, oh, okay, you're a teenager. Here's what you need to worry about with being a teenager. with testosterone and explaining to me what's happening to my body as it's changing. And that has been a gift. I've talked to several different therapists because I have lots of clients that are therapists in this, that do this work and say, oh my God, I wish every person who was transitioning had that from that gender. So whether they're going male to female or female to male, had some support from a cis part of the community, helping them navigate what that means to truly be the person they always were, even though they weren't in the right body.
Because even if you felt you were in the wrong body, you grew up with the rules about how to be female.
Exactly. And I didn't really want the toxic masculinity rules, but I did need some help with some things as my body was changing as a result of the testosterone. And I could talk to trans guys, and there's another kind of brotherhood in that as well. But these are men who have always been men. They always had these boy traits and feelings and hormones, and to have them help me learn how to navigate the world more appearing masculine, presenting as masculine, but not being toxic, and enjoying it and laughing about the things that are funny, because there are some funny things when you start testosterone. And the other thing that's very interesting, so when I first came out to my partner, so it was about 2.5 years ago, so I was just shy of 59 years old. At the time I came out and finally said, yes, this is who I am, I said I was not going to be doing any hormones because I was already through menopause. Why would I add hormones to my body? And there was no way I was going to have any kind of surgery. So that just says it doesn't matter what age you are, you don't know what the journey's going to look like, because here I am 2.5 years later. Yes, I've been on testosterone for about 1.5 years, and I just had my top surgery. One of the things that helped me with the top surgery decision too was that I have a few friends in the community who don't identify as trans. 2 of them actually even still identify very much as lesbian women who chose to have top surgery because they never were comfortable with having breasts. And it was like, oh my God, if you could do it just for that reason, because I had that same feeling even aside from the trans issues, but I hated breastfeeding. As far as I was concerned, they were useless parts of my body that I would just assume get rid of. And that made the decision much, much easier when I found out, oh, it can just be a choice.
Yeah, in Arlene Stein's book that I was telling you about, the 4 young people that she follows, one of them fits that description as a person who has no intention to become a male, just wanted the top surgery as its own choice.
And that's something we didn't have 20 years ago. The idea of any kind of breast surgery 20 years ago for us was we were going to get them bigger. We weren't going to make them go away.
Yeah, I've always been grateful that mine are I consider just right. But anyway, what about your kids? How has that gone with your kids?
So I have 4 children, and they are amazing. They're incredibly supportive. One lives out of country, and he's probably the one that, because he lives in a much more conservative country, he's a little more laid back about it. They all 100% support me. And they still call me Mama. That was one of the first conversations we had. And it's like, no, I gave birth to you. I'm always going to be your Mama. That's fine. And actually, the oldest one, who lives in Japan, just got married, and his new wife is now calling me Mama. So that's going to be an interesting, and they're going to have a child. So we have no idea what the grandchild is going to do until we get there. The child that's had the hardest time with it is my daughter. I have a severely handicapped daughter, and she doesn't entirely understand everything. But what she knows is when I come in to visit her, I sound much different. My voice went down about 2 octaves as a result of the testosterone, and so I sound much, much different. Every time I go see her, I have to make sure that I get close to her face. I let her feel my face. She's like, okay, this is who, and it takes a few minutes for her to be, okay, I do know who this is. That's been the most difficult part, but my 3 sons have been amazing. They've just been incredible about the whole process.
And how has this affected your place in the rainbow community? Since you have the fortune of living in a place that has one.
Yes. The rainbow community in Portland has shifted a bit for me in the last several years, not just because of coming out as trans, but also because it's just, Portland is considered one of the country's trans meccas. We have people coming here from all over the country, and it's like, you don't understand. It's not all as wonderful as you think it is. So I've become a lot more involved in the issues related to trans folks and not as much related to the other letters of the rainbow, although we don't exclude them. What I do notice that's really interesting is that in my CPA practice, one of the things that's happened is in the last probably 6 months, we've gotten several new clients who have 2 or 3 years worth of tax returns to do, because when they were transitioning, part of what happened is that they didn't want to have to deal with the fact that some of their documents had their dead name, some had the right name. There's this time period where it takes to go through transition. And so they just stopped doing their tax returns. Then to have them come to an office where they come in and was like, yeah, we don't care. It's a non-issue to us. And it's like, what is your name? Your name is whatever you want me to call you. I don't care what your documents say. That's between us and the government. That has nothing to do with who you are. That's been a big change in where I am in the community. It's seeing people more holistically and treating everyone more holistically.
So do you feel, because you mentioned that you never really felt that the label lesbian was right for you. For other people in your position who maybe fully embrace the idea of being lesbian first and then later realize that they were trans, I'm just wondering, especially for our generation or slightly before us, where there was, these very, the feminist part of the lesbian community that really were woman power, being a woman would see transitioning to being a male as almost some kind of betrayal. Have you run into any of that?
I really haven't run into any of that. One of the things, it's interesting you would pick the word feminist, because that was one thing I was going to say. Is like, I've always been a feminist. I always will be a feminist. My grandmother worked on the suffragists get the right to vote. I've been raised in a feminist tradition, regardless of what my gender expression is, and wholeheartedly believe in that. But one of the things I did notice is that I was recently, in August, I was at a conference in the East Coast that was LGBTQ business professionals, and they had a trans meeting. And then afterwards, we went to a happy hour, and there was about 4 trans guys in various, and for the first time in my life, I actually understood what the need is for either lesbians or feminists or women in general to have a group of women. Because I never felt comfortable in any women's groups, quote unquote. But when I was with those guys at the conference, and it was like, oh, this is what the women have been talking about their whole life, that I now understand in a way that I never understood it before, because I didn't really belong. So I think it's possible that if you're a lesbian and you identify as a lesbian, and even though you're on the butch spectrum, but that's where you get your support and your community from, I don't think transitioning means you have to give that up. And it doesn't make you don't stop being a feminist just because you transition. And I think that might be part of the fear that some people who are on the more masculine side of the butch lesbian identity, who might even want to transition. I think that may be, at least that was one of my fears. And I can't tell you how much that came up for myself when I first started the journey really clearly of transition, was that, oh my God, am I betraying women? Am I betraying my own kind? And I guess when I got to that conference in August, there was this realization, oh, no, I wasn't I'm not betraying my own kind, because that never really was my kind. This is my kind. People who identify as masculine, but were born into a feminine body.
But it looks like the experience may be very different for the people coming up behind us. I mean, if now, I actually went to a PFLAG meeting, and it was funny because it seemed like it was all parents and grandparents of trans kids, which was just a little odd. And one of them was a parent of a 4-year-old child. And I'm just thinking, do I want every tomboy to be labeled as trans? That doesn't feel right to me.
Yeah, I could see where that fear could be there. And I could actually see that might happen. Personally, what's interesting to me is that my youngest child in February of this year told me that they were trans. So now I'm on the parent bench watching this 23-year-old person navigate their way through transition from a male to a female. It's an interesting bench to be on. I can tell you, it's a very interesting bench to be on. Once they came out to me and I started really watching, it didn't surprise me, but it kind of took me back a little bit at first because I did not expect it. Kids that can identify earlier, I think it's great. But you're right. I don't necessarily think that you want every tomboy little girl that will be trans. I don't think that's necessarily going to be the case.
Because I have plenty of straight friends who were tomboys. I just think to say that automatically means you're trans because it's just as bad as being labeled as, oh, you're queer because you like sports, which happened to us back in the 70s.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Well, and that's one of the things, I guess, thinking back on my own experience, I was probably, when we were definitely in the main house we were raised in, so I was probably around 4 or 5, maybe 6, when I realized that I was exactly the same as my brother and my dad, but I didn't have the same body. And I didn't understand that. And there were different sets of rules for me than there were for them. And that did not make any sense to me at all. One of the things I think is happening is that the younger folks that are getting raised now, because the parents maybe are a little more aware of gender issues and gender being fluid, are not putting such hard and fast rules. Like I have one client who has a 3-year-old son who often there are pictures on Instagram or Facebook of the outfit that Dean picked today, and it's a sundress with sandals. And the parents are like, yeah, whatever. Doesn't necessarily make him trans. It just means, he likes what he likes. And they let him do that.
That sounds great.
I know. So I have some real hope in that respect that the next generations coming up are not going to have nearly the issues that we had.
But I do wonder whether having so many choices isn't its own burden.
I'm sure in some places it will be, yeah. For some kids it will be, I'm sure. But I have to trust their parents, much as I would like to not. But yeah.
JAX, what else would you like to share with my listeners?
I think the one thing that, even though I was in my mid-40s when I came out as being sexually attracted to women, not men, and in my late 50s before I actually started transitioning, I don't think there's an ever too late. And the other thing is that I don't regret any of that process that got me to where I'm at. I don't think back, if I'd have recognized in my early 20s when women were flirting with me that, I was attracted to them, I would have had a totally different life. And I don't look back and regret any of that or want to change any of the way that happened. So I guess that would be the owning of your own story, whatever that might be. I don't make any apologies for it. My ex-husband and I have gone through quite a bit, and that was the hardest letter to write. Definitely. That was the hardest conversation to have, was about my transition with my former husband, who's my kid's father and, going to be in my life for the rest of my life, because we are very committed to, we are the parents of these children and have been, but it was worth it. And it's all worth it. It's not always easy. Worth it.
Is there any particular, if you had some piece of advice that you wish someone had given you?
Because I don't really think I would go back and do anything differently than the way I've done it. I think I don't really, perhaps I wish that had my youngest child who came out as trans, had they been more comfortable when they first figured it out for themselves, maybe it wouldn't have been, I wouldn't have said, I've got to wait until they get through high school and are a little more secure before I go after what I want. That might be the only thing maybe that I would do differently, and having done it 10 years ago rather than doing it now. But I don't know. Now I also have 10 more years with my partner, and we have a more committed relationship and have been through a lot together. So it would have been a different experience. So I can't really think of any.
That sounds reasonable. And I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me today. A lot of the people that listen to this show are still stuck at the how to come out to the people in their lives place. And it sounds like you kind of just took that bull by the horn and just did it.
Yes, I did. The first coming out was a lot easier than the trans coming out. I cannot tell you the number of times my adult children said, when are you going to talk to Dad? When are you going to talk to Dad? When are you going to talk to Dad? So I had a lot of pushing on that particular one. That was the hard. But once I made that jump, it's been pretty easy. So I guess if I were going to give anybody advice, it'd be like, okay, figure what's the big one? Do the big one first, and then it's kind of downhill from there.
Right. That's like when I'm trying to talk to somebody about how to quit smoking, I always say, figure out which cigarette would be the hardest to give up and figure out a plan for that one first.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
I want to thank JAX Wheatley again for taking the time to talk with me. When I first listened to this interview, several things stood out for me. First, like JAX said, it is never too late. But more importantly, I appreciate the attitude JAX has toward their past. They don't spend time regretting that they didn't come out sooner or that they didn't transition sooner. Instead, they focus on how everything in their past helped them become the person they are today. This idea that it is never too late is worth repeating. But I bet some of you are thinking, well, they live in Portland, one of the most LGBT-friendly communities in the country. It would be too hard where I live. If so, I want to suggest looking at their experience from a different angle. They told us that even though they live in a very supportive environment, they actually put off their transition for many years until they felt their life was more settled. So for me, the take-home point is no one else can decide when the time is right. Each one of us faces a unique situation. Even if you are only out to yourself, I want you to feel honored and supported here. This brings me to our private Facebook group, which is intended to be a place where listeners can interact with one another. Private means no one outside the group can see what is posted, but unfortunately, membership is not secret. The reason I didn't make the group secret was because I was hoping to reach people who didn't necessarily listen to podcasts. If this is an issue for you, please email me at grainrainbows@gmail.com so I can help you find a safe place. Otherwise, if you want to join the Grain Rainbows Facebook group, go to the fan page and click on the link on the right side of the logo. Then you'll need to answer a few brief questions, including confirming that you're over the age of 30. If you want to leave a public comment about Grain Rainbows, please post that on the Grain Rainbows fan page. I'm always looking for listeners who are willing to share their story. Sharing your story can be very empowering, but it's also a great way to help others who are on this journey. If you're interested, just email me at grainrainbows@gmail.com. I'd also like to play voice feedback on the show. So if you want to make a brief audio comment, just go to speakpipe.com/Doc Artemis. Last but not least, I want to thank those of you who are supporting the show financially. Donations are going to pay for expenses like hosting and my largest expense, which is audio editing. If you want to support Grain Rainbows, there are two options. You can go to patreon.com/Grain Rainbows to make a monthly pledge of any amount. If you want to make a single donation, you can use Venmo, VNMO. My username there is Doc Artemis. The reason I'm using Venmo instead of PayPal is that if you pay me directly from your Venmo or your checking, they don't take a cut. If you use your credit card, they take a cut. When this episode airs, Grain Rainbows will be almost 1 year old. My goal going forward is to continue to release an episode on the first Monday of every month. In the meantime, I hope you'll check out my other podcasts, Books and Ideas, and Brain Science. Thanks again for listening. I look forward to talking with you again very soon. Grain Rainbows is copyright Virginia Campbell, MD. You can copy this show to share it with others, but for any other uses or derivatives, please contact me at grainrainbows@gmail.com.